All right, so today we're going to be talking about something that's not quite directly perf related. If you were at Colt's keynote earlier this morning and you could understand what he was saying, he said yes, perf matters, and perf does matter, but it doesn't matter quite so much if you can't get the user you need signed in or signed up to the app that you're building. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how you can get users signed up or signed into your apps a lot more easily by using a variety of different technologies on Android and ones that are provided by Google. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction, my name is Steven. I work on the identity team at Google, and identity at Google is really about knowing who the user is. So knowing that it's them when they come to see their Gmail, and that it's not the bad guys, keep the bad guys out. And over the years, we've been thinking a lot about how to get the Google users signed in, but in doing that and keeping all of those Google users secure, we've come up with a pretty strong account system that could be very useful to the third-party ecosystem, to all of the app developers that are out there who are thinking about how to get their users signed in or signed up. And it's probably a problem that you might have encountered yourself if you're building an app. I certainly, before coming to Google, actually worked at a bunch of startups, and this is, I think, one of the fundamental problems, that if you need to have some kind of account system for your users to be able to keep track of their information, to be able to personalize content to them, you need to know who they are, and it can be a real barrier to actually have somebody sign up or sign into a service. It's something that where you could have, in fact, a lot of the apps that we work with have seen that in the order of 50% of the people who see their login screen just take off or fail to log in the first place. And so that is really a major problem if 50% of the potential people who are using your app or your service are going to evaporate right away before they even get in the door. So thinking about that and putting it kind of in the perspective of all these things you have to think about, performance and getting users into your apps, making sure that that is as frictionless as possible is really one of the key ones that you have to keep in mind. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. Some of the solutions that you've probably heard about before are things like Google SignIn. If you've wandered around the web, you see these Google SignIn buttons all over the place. And it is a really nice solution. It certainly gives you the ability to log in with a click without having to create more usernames and passwords. It's kind of the opportunity to replace some of these password logins that you've maybe used in the past. But it's not the complete solution, in that there are still apps and sites out there that use passwords and usernames, and we have to think about what to do there. And that's one of the new technologies that I'd like to talk about today, which is this concept of smart lock for passwords, or an API to save login information that users have collected in the past through Chrome, through the password manager there, and be able to make it available programmatically on Android. So very cool, and I think it's one of the most exciting things that we've seen in the authentication space in a long time. So just to get into what I'll cover today and give you the quick overview, there's Google SignIn, and I'll give you a little bit of an update of what we're doing there. But basically, Google SignIn is this cross-platform solution. It works on iOS and Android and on the web, that it makes signing in or signing up really easy, that it enables access to a lot of other Google APIs, so very useful there, and that it can facilitate some nice things like being able to download an associated app from your website. So that's been around for a while, and I kind of use this analogy of comparing the Google SignIn, which is like a replacement for the different keys you may use to log into different services around the web. You can kind of imagine going from site to site, and each one presents like a door that you have to unlock. You have to have a different key. And over time, you accumulate a lot of these keys. They get pretty heavy in your pocket. And you kind of end up in this situation where it's nice to have a Google SignIn, but you still have a lot in your pocket to worry about. And to kind of complete the analogy then, the idea behind a smart lock for passwords is that you can put all of these keys on a keychain, kind of in the same idea as a password manager, but by making it a programmatic interface, we can do a lot more, that we can build user interfaces that don't even involve a sign-in screen anymore if you can programmatically pull login information up for a given user. So that's one of the really exciting pieces, and I'll show you some pieces of the UI and what it looks like and how you can integrate it in your app too. But in short, it's a cross-platform single sign-in solution working on Android right now, and there's APIs in the beta channel for Chrome as well. Save and retrieve that login information could be username, passwords, but also more generally as an API, in fact, saving other kinds of login, whether a user signed in with Google or with Facebook or Twitter, and making that all available the next time they come back so that they don't even have to think about kind of the new problem that has been introduced by all of these other different ways to log in, which is to remember which button was clicked, let alone what the username or the password was, and how to link all of those together. Those are really being addressed by this more broad solution in Smart Lock for Passwords. We've had quite a bit of luck, actually, with getting partners on board with this Smart Lock for Passwords set of APIs. You can see some icons of a few noteworthy ones we launched with earlier this year: Netflix, New York Times, LinkedIn coming soon, Orbitz, Eventbrite, which you might have even used if you had your tickets through Eventbrite today, and Instacart. But before I get into the Smart Lock for Passwords, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the latest on SignIn is. So Google SignIn, or in the past what you probably had seen or maybe have implemented in your own app, is Google Plus SignIn. So this has really been changing over the last few months, that you no longer need a Google Plus account for many things at Google, and that includes signing in. So if you have used the API in the last few months, since we've updated it on Android, on iOS, and on the web, you'll see that the default set of things that your Google Sign-In implementation asks for no longer includes Google Plus information. It's what we call the basic set of profile scopes. So that's things like email, information about the user's name and profile picture. And with that more basic set of information, you can brand it, and by default, it's now branded just with the plain Google logo, the new one with the colors that we put out there just last month, and really a much cleaner experience for the end user. I'll show you exactly what it looks like in a sec. But the general idea here, again, is that this is the gateway to all of Google's APIs, that it's not just knowing who the user is on Google, the name and the email address, but in fact having access to things like their contacts, be able to pull messages out of their Gmail, store things in Drive, upload to YouTube, anything you can imagine, payment information, and a lot of other really useful stuff. So not just the authentication piece, but also the authorization piece. But in talking about that, we should really see what the UI looks like now in this streamlined model, where if you've used a Google Plus sign-in in the past, you might have seen some of these. The older APIs on Android looked like that first screen, which kind of harks back to the old days of Android with the hollow theme. That's kind of on the way out with the material world these days. The new API on Android, I should actually mention that this new API is rolling out right now. So if you're looking to build it into your app, wait for the next Play Services update. It will be in there. And with it, you get this very nice UI. So just to say that this is like a one-tap experience now, that if you click on the plain Google Sign-In button, you'll get a picker for which account you want to sign in with. That's the basic profile set of information, very clean, one tap. And it replaces a lot of what users had some frustration or road bumps in the process before, which is things like kind of the ugly picker, the having to create a Google Plus account if they didn't have one already, and then kind of a wall of text around getting access to circles, information, things like that, that for a lot of apps in reality didn't end up using. So kind of a barrier to getting into your app quickly and easily. And so that's one of the big pieces that have been addressed here. And certainly if you are an Android developer who's put this into your app, do take a look at the latest APIs as they come out, because you'll have this much streamlined experience. And then you can also then, what we say, incrementally ask for additional scopes, additional permissions to access the user's Google data, things like contacts and so on, and be able to do it then in context. So one tap to sign in, and then at the time you need to access contact information to send messages, for example, you can do it then and have the user understand what that is actually being used for. So really aligning nicely with the device level permissions that you might be seeing in Android with the Marshmallow release. Okay, so that's kind of the latest on sign-in. So watch out for that one coming in the next couple weeks on Android. But to get into the Smart Lock for Password side of things. So I mentioned this earlier, but basically using something like a Google Sign-In is this opportunity to replace the password. So have kind of a super key that you can use across the doors that you encounter on the web, and no longer have to remember these passwords or come up with new ones for the sites that you encounter. But again, like I said, not everyone uses a Google Sign-In or Facebook or Twitter Sign-In. There's still a lot of people out there who, for whatever reason, choose or prefer to log in with passwords. And there are a lot of sites that still use passwords for whatever legacy reason. They've been around for a long time. They have established user bases. They just prefer having their own proprietary login system with their own username and passwords. And that does present a problem. Like, if you've got that heavy pocket full of keys, then you might think about ways to lighten the load. That if you just went out there and used one key across all the doors that you came across, then you'd only have that one to worry about. Or if you used a really simple, light one that's easy to remember, an easy password, it could certainly lighten your pocket, but it can also introduce a pretty major security vulnerability, which is that if that one key that you rely on gets stolen, gets picked out of your pocket, then people can basically walk through all of the doors that you would encounter. And if that key is really light and simple, easy to counterfeit, you have the same problem. So thinking about how to encourage people to move to stronger passwords, make them easier to use, and then eventually move to ways to move beyond passwords is really where we're trying to get the industry to go. And by providing these APIs to the third-party ecosystem on Android, we hope to make that a lot easier. So let me get into Smart Lock for passwords. And again, I'll just motivate it by saying that this is probably one of the things that as an app developer, you're really conscious of, that there's a lot of time and effort and energy that goes into marketing the apps or the services that you're building to make people aware of what it is that you're offering to them, and to get them to download the app can be a pretty expensive and time-consuming process. And that's just the beginning then. You have to get them to open it, to get engaged, and that means potentially signing up for an account or signing in. And that could be a very, very frictionful process that as soon as people see that screen where they have to create yet another account, like I said earlier, in the apps that we've worked with, there's often 50% or more bounce rate there, that those users are evaporating right off the bat. So much for all of the marketing and the download effort that went into that user. And that even if they do sign in, it's very often the case that it wasn't the first attempt that succeeded, that there was a wrong password in there, that you picked on a different provider and it's asking you to link accounts or do something really confusing, all problematic. And I think like the opportunity here is that to get to that bottom of the funnel, to get the really engaged user, you can use something like Smart Lock to make it completely seamless. So to get rid of this conversion killer, and just to make it clear how this works as an API, I'll walk through a bit of an example with some UI. But just to kind of give you the architecture here, like I mentioned earlier, one way to think about it is that there are users who have probably been using Chrome for years and stored a lot of their login information. I have a lot of my information in the cloud in this way, basically stored with their Google accounts, all the passwords they've gone and entered to different sites that they've come across on the web. And a lot of that information is very valuable, that it would be great if you could access that on Android in a native app, your associated app with your website. And that's what is made possible here by these APIs that we're calling part of the Smart Lock suite of technologies to basically make sign-in and authentication wherever you go really easy. So it's all backed by this sort of cloud Google account stored information, login information like passwords. And let's see how it works in an app like a publisher app, for example, NYTimes. So NYTimes launched with us. And you can imagine a scenario like this. You're a NYTimes reader. You've set up on your phone, for example, a subscription to the NYTimes, entered your payment information, all of that. Really invested user, and you've put a lot of effort into setting up this account on your phone. Now, the problem is that maybe you have a second device or you buy a tablet, something like that, and now you open up the NYTimes app and it shows you the login screen yet again. And it could very well have been the case that you set up that NYTimes account a long time ago, that it could have been a year ago. And now you have no idea what email address you used, what the password was, and then it's a very, very painful experience of recovering that. For the NYTimes, they have to provide support to all of these users who are their paid customers to be able to get back into their accounts. So that's really an opportunity. And so if you think about this sort of new device or second device, you can imagine that we've done a lot of work to get that device bootstrapped, to get all of the apps and the services that you were previously using on Android available right there. We call this the tap and go setup experience, where all of the apps are kind of put back onto the new device. They're even in the same place. But again, this fundamental problem of opening that app and seeing that it's not signed in. So now look what the experience is with this API integration. As soon as that New York Times app is opened, there's a notification here to the user. This is a first run experience. The text is a little bit hard to read on the screen here, but basically what it's saying is that you've been signed back in automatically with information that you've saved with Google. So the last time you used this on an Android device, you opted in to save whatever login information that you input, and now it's been retrieved programmatically by the app. The app is able to look at what kind of login information is available for this user, and then be able to basically use it to skip the login screen. So just think about that for a second, that it's not just the experience that you've seen in Chrome where your username and password is filled in, and the user still has to find the login page. It's that this user just opens up the app, and they're in just like that. And then, of course, being the cross-platform solution, you can think about other scenarios where this is really powerful. So let's use Eventbrite for a second example. And like I said earlier, Eventbrite was one of the ticketing apps, I think, for this event, and probably for a lot of others that you might encounter. And maybe this time you start on the web, where you actually made the purchase of tickets or something like that. And you could very well have been an Eventbrite user for a long time in Chrome, and over the years come to save passwords for events or for sites like Eventbrite in the Chrome password manager. And if you've signed into Chrome, then you've basically synced all of this information up to the cloud. You've saved it with your Google account. And if you go to another device with Chrome, it'll very helpfully fill it in for you. But of course, you end up in an app. And so maybe you're in the line here and you need to show your ticket. Everybody's waiting behind you. And if you open up the app and realize that you need to log in to get that ticket, it can be pretty stressful to type that in with your thumbs while everyone's waiting and hope that you've got the right password. So the experience now, if you just open up the app with this integration in it, and you can try this out yourself. If you might already be signed into Eventbrite, but if you uninstall and reinstall it, you can actually see how it will just sign you in automatically. It'll give you this blue bar at the bottom that says your login information. And from that point on, again, you've basically just skipped the entire login flow. And as an app developer, you can think about how valuable this is, that you can skip all of the warm welcomes and the things that are just getting in the way of your really engaged and most valuable users getting to their content. OK, so that's Eventbrite. And let's walk through maybe one more example. So think about moving in the other direction and thinking about some of the other powerful things that this API can do. So suppose we're setting up your flights or your travel information to the big Android barbecue. And in order to do that, you had to, of course, go to a travel website and probably look up some flight information, plan an itinerary, that kind of thing. One of the big ones out there that I like using is Orbitz, and we've got them on board with this API as well. And the idea here then is that you could start all of your travel planning, do all of your research on mobile, on a phone or a tablet, and then you can save it and use it in Chrome or on other platforms. But there's more to it than that. With this API is actually pretty powerful in that there's more than just the save and retrieve API. There's another one that we provide, also coming out in the update in a week or two with the version that's rolling out right now. It's basically this ability to help the user sign up in the first place. And so how this works is basically if the person has saved their login information for a variety of different apps and sites, and they've got a Google account, then we know some information about them. We know which email addresses they use, the different ways that they log in, and we can present to the end user basically this dialog at the time that they need to sign in. You can have them pick, if your system is based on email addresses or on phone numbers, basically have them pick the information that they need to sign in with, so the email address that they would prefer. And the nice thing about this, if you've been working with M or permissions on Marshmallow, is that this dialog calling into the Play services doesn't actually require any device permissions. So now you've got something very, very useful here, that you don't need to ask for get accounts or don't need to ask for phone number permission anymore. You can have the user give you that information by calling into a Play Services API. So they pick that email address. And then, in fact, if you think about some of the optimizations to your app that you could do, you could actually put the user into the right flow if they're an existing user, know that they need to sign back in, know how they should be logging in for that email address, for example. Or you can intelligently put them into a sign-up flow. So in the case of this example, let's say that we'll just do an account creation here or sign into an existing account. So you have to put in the username and the password. So let's just suppose it's a password account. But that said, you could do very well the same thing for the other different types of login. That if the user were to sign in with Google or with Facebook, you have that opportunity once they've entered this information to save that pointer, basically, that it was a Facebook or a Google sign-in, and that's what you should trigger the next time. So we'll take a look at how that looks in a sec. But basically, at the point that they've entered this information, they get a prompt that says, would you like to save the password that you've entered? This is the opt-in to basically store the information with Google. It's very similar in functionality to what you've probably seen in Chrome, where there's a bubble that pops up, and there's a save and no thanks. Same idea here, that they opt in to save that information to the Google account. And then once it's stored in the cloud, then it's available, it's synced across all the different platforms, it's synced to Chrome. And then in fact, if you go to Chrome, you can see that information filled in. So you can try this out yourself in the Orbitz app. It's live along with the other partners. Basically, the ability to go from one platform to the other, have that information fill in using the existing Chrome password manager. But in fact, there's even better stuff coming. That in the Chrome beta channel right now, we've been working with the community to basically put a spec out there, a web spec, that enables password management or credential management more generally as a programmatic API in the browser. So if you read up on the spec, navigator.credentials, you can check for that availability of that API in the browser you're using, coming to Chrome pretty soon. And basically, if that API is available, then you can do the same programmatic functionality that I've described on Android in the browser. So imagine going from your Android app to the Chrome on the same device and having those two in sync because you know the user in both places, or going to another device altogether where this person potentially has never visited your site before, but since the Google account is there, you can do an automatic sign-in. So they could show up through search results, something like that, and have a completely seamless experience. And that really highlights one of the values here that I think makes this interesting to Google and to the ecosystem as a whole, is that this just enables the end user who doesn't even really understand the concept of saving credential information or how it works, and just give them this seamless experience as they go across the web, whether they're coming through search results or they're going to your website directly. Their state is there, and they're put into the place that they need to be, pick up right where they are left off, and the ability to re-engage and give them the best experience possible. So that's kind of an overview of how basically the UI works and how it looks in apps that you might see out there right now. In fact, I just looked up this morning who's using the API right now, and I already showed you some examples of big ones like Netflix with their TV app coming out as well, the idea that you can sign in on Android or Chrome and then be signed in on an Android TV as well. So that's pretty cool, and Times and Eventbrite, Orbitz, Instacart, others. But some nice big ones that have launched recently are TripAdvisor, Overstock, Fancy, Gold Star, another ticketing app, and some big ones coming soon like LinkedIn, TuneIn, Evernote, Groupon, Ticketmaster, and lots more internationally too, ones like eBay's properties around the world. All of these apps and sites basically leveraging this opportunity to keep their user signed in. So let me talk a little bit about what you actually need to do to put this into the app or the site that you're building. So I'll focus on the Android side today since we're at an Android developer conference. And if you'd like to find out more about this, we're going to run a code lab tomorrow. So in fact, what I'll show you in a sec here is that it's pretty simple. It's just a couple of API calls. And you could probably come to the session tomorrow and get it implemented in your app. So if there's anything that you take away from the conference, this might be a good one. You can get this very high ROI, like very, very big improvement to the login flow of your app by just adding a few lines of code. So the first thing you need is Play Services on the latest version. So many of you probably already have Play Services in your app. Probably wouldn't be too big an issue to just move over to the latest version. And then from there, basically how it works is when the app starts, you call into the API and you say, hey, are there any credentials saved for the current users on this device? And so, of course, this is backed by the Google account. And on Android, the vast majority of people are signed in with a Google account. They have the ability to store this information. And in fact, if they've already saved something in Chrome, it could very well be the case that even if you're launching this integration in your Android app anew, that they already have something saved from Chrome. We've seen in the order of 10 to 15% just right off the bat to get an automatic sign-in experience. So that's pretty cool. So what you do is you call request, you wait for a callback, and then you look at the result. And the result could be a couple of different scenarios here that I'll walk through. There's either exactly one credential available, and this is the auto sign-in scenario. The idea being that you get a successful result back, you look inside and see what kind of credential it was. I mentioned earlier that could very well be the case that it's not just a username password credential. It could be the fact that they signed in with Google or Facebook. The token for those kind of sign-ins isn't actually stored in the API. It's just a pointer. It says, this user signed in with Facebook last time. You should trigger the Facebook flow and make sure that have Facebook validate or Google validate or Twitter validate that this is the same user as before. So that's the kind of scenario for a so-called federated or identity provider login. But then, of course, there's still the scenario where this person logged in with a password. And then you simply get the password back. And you can imagine the experience for an automatic sign-in is basically filling out the fields for them and tapping the button. But the nice thing there is that you don't even need to show them that UI. You can hide this behind the splash screen of your app. And all they see is the nice blue bar on top of the splash screen. And the next view that they've got after that is the signed-in state, picking up wherever they left off from the last session or the last device. So you have to think about a couple of corner cases. So one of the common ones is if someone has multiple credentials saved. For example, this could be a shared device where you have multiple people signed in. They've saved information to different accounts. And the idea here is that we need to have some disambiguation, that one of the person who's seeing this screen, the login experience, is that they'll actually have to pick between the two or more credentials. It's also the scenario that if they, for their account, have disabled automatic sign-in, one of the Google settings there, not the default, but there are a few people who want to have that level of control, which is nice, be able to pick the credential that they want to sign in with. And to kind of detect that in the code that you write, you basically just check for this state resolution required in the result that you get back. If it's resolution required, then you can fire off an intent at whatever point in your UI fits in. And then the idea is that you'll be called back when the user picks one of the saved credentials. Or they could very well cancel and create a new account, something like that. So then, under the scenario that there's nothing saved in the API, you have to think, kind of going back to that Orbitz example that we talked about, that what do you do if there's nothing saved? And a nice thing here is that this is just a API on top of whatever you've already built. So basically, you could very well just operate in the scenario that this API were not there, that the user is going to have to manually select or input their login information. And this works out perfectly well, that it's certainly not a loss of anything that you currently had. But now you've got a couple of opportunities here. One is that you can check in this state that if it's valuable, you can use that picker I showed earlier, that you can have them tap with one action the identifier that they need, the email address or the phone number, and use that to bootstrap the sign-in process. Or you could just use the existing flow. And if you go through the existing flow, then you have the opportunity after they've entered login information and you've validated that it's correct, you have the opportunity to present them with that save dialog we showed earlier. And then once this information is saved, then next time they come back, they'll be able to do the automatic sign-in. And in fact, like I mentioned earlier, we had some big names there, and the performance on those apps has just been really fantastic. So for Netflix, for example, huge 100 million users plus, they see in the order of 30 or 40% of their users being signed in automatically with this. That's a complete change, that those users, you can imagine, are now reducing by basically the same proportion all of their failed login attempts. So by incorporating a couple of lines of code into your apps, letting it run for a little while to collect the login information from Android sign-ins, you're now getting your users into a state where they can be signed in automatically almost half of the time. And half of the time will ultimately be the steady state, because when someone sees one of those save dialogues, we have, in fact, the majority of people opt in to save. So long as they have set up an account or have signed in at least once, they'll get into that state. And I think ultimately, like where we see the kind of steady state balance between Chrome and Android being is the majority being originally saved on Android. So the idea being that everyone who logs in on Android is shown that prompt. It's a modal dialog. Opt-in rates are very good. And the Android to Android scenario of user going from one device to another, either getting a new device, moving between devices, signing out, restoring the app, something like that, is very powerful and will be a very common case. So even if you only do Android development, it's worth thinking about this. But that said, if you do have a website, it's worth putting the two together so that they can share credentials. And in order to do that, there's a couple of steps in our developer documentation. But the general idea here is that in order to ensure the security of this of this connection, you assert ownership of the website that you've got. One of the requirements is that you have an HTTPS site, so just to ensure that everything that's stored there or retrieved there can be securely passed to the user. The general idea that you assert ownership over your HTTPS website, and then once you've got that, you go into the Play developer console and basically say that your app is associated to that website. And then with that link made, we can basically have the credentials stored in either location be available when the API is called in Chrome on the beta channel or on Android in the current version of Play services. So that's a pretty cool experience. I think that really sums up what's possible here. And I think that if you look at how it's been doing so far, I think one of the main points or the stories that I'd like to tell is that this is not just an API for kind of the people who know what a password manager is, but in fact an API for anybody on Android. That in reality, with some of the big apps that have launched already, we have over 300 million downloads of apps enabled with this API, and we've had 50 million people in just a few months save or retrieve some kind of login information. And if you think about that number, that's more than any of the password managers on Android have ever been downloaded in the first place. So this is really aiming to be the login solution for everyone, that it's a state or a user experience where people don't even have to think about password management or login management. They just do whatever they need to do, they save that information, and they get in a state where they never need to see or manage that information again. They'll just be signed in. So available on Android right now, if you check out developers.google.com/identity, you can see the APIs and how to implement it and integrate it into your app. There's a couple of guides there about the user experience and the places where you should make these API calls. Pretty simple, how to handle the different corner cases and edge cases, things like logout or incorrect stored password. And if you're really interested in that, do join us tomorrow. There's going to be a code lab session in the morning. I think it's at 9:30, a little bit early. But basically, in a couple of hours, you'll be able to put these APIs into your app and get a lot of your users in an experience where they just don't need to think about logging in anymore. And that's really where we hope to take all of this in the future, is to bring it to all platforms and basically make it an experience where you can tap on an assisted sign-in dialog to create an account, make it very easy to get signed up, and then wherever you go, you don't need to worry about how to log back in. That's what we hope to bring to users, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow to find out how to put it into your app. Thank you.